Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Lemak, and I am the Chief Curator of History here at the New York State Museum. And because a lot of you are home right now, we thought we would continue our Facebook Live series and bring some really interesting and obscure collections to you this afternoon. This is one of our vaudeville and circus collections. It is one of my favorites in the museum's collection. So what we have in front of me is only a small percentage of this collection. It's the DeMarlo collection, and they are artifacts from two vaudeville and circus performers from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So I'm going to start with Frieda DeMarlo. She was born Frieda Gopst in Germany in 1890. She started working in a dance troupe in Germany and met an American who was in Europe named Dwight Morrow, and his stage name was Harry DeMarlo. Harry was 8 years older, and he toured Europe in a vaudeville dance outfit and was already well known before he met Frieda. The two started dating and then decided to get married. And like I said, Harry already had his own shtick going, and Frieda started to get a little restless, kind of waiting for Harry to do his thing. So she started to get into the contortion business as well. Their first act together was called A Frog's Paradise, which debuted around 1920. And in it, both of them would wear frog costumes and then do contortions. And I'm going to read from I did this lecture years ago, and let's see. So the Frog's Paradise is what they were most known for. And they also, part of the Frog's Paradise was a woodland scene. And then after our photographer gets a picture of the frog's head, here's Frieda in her promotional photo. They made all of their own costumes, and they spangled their own costumes. And spangled is putting the glitter, sewing each piece of glitter on there. Today you know it as bedazzling. But they made all their own costumes, they decorated their own costumes, and they were very resourceful. But the Frog's Paradise, which they were most well known for, the stage was set in an enchanting woodland scene with leaves, trees, a full moon, worms, and bugs lit by tiny light bulbs on strings. And in the center of a giant water lily where Frieda emerged as a giant frog, dancing and bending about the stage. A storm approaches the woodland scene, and Harry appears on stage and contorts his body in a variety of poses. After the storm passes, Frieda's frog turns into a nymph and more dancing. There was a special musical score created specifically for this act. We have that sheet music for that act. And this was, the Frog's Paradise was the vaudeville act that really put them on the map. They performed this all over the globe. They performed it to royalty. They performed it to the King of Siam. They were most known for the Frog's Paradise.
And we already have a couple of questions. Mostly about the costume and what's made out of. So first of all, what is the costume made out of? And then secondly, are the sequins plastic?
Oh, that's a great question. So the frog's head is made out of paper mache and paint. And then down here, it's probably a silk fabric that's been painted over. And I think these look like they're metal sequins. If you can, I'm not sure how well you can see those. Right. And then you might be able to get a better view of the sequins. This was one of the variations of the Frog Paradise. I'm not sure who was in this costume. It was either Harry or Frieda, but they would use this in the woodland scene and dance around and contort. And I can kind of hold it up for you. That would be perfect. So one thing that puts these kind of acts makes them international is that because they were doing poses and contortions and dances, there was no language barrier, so they could perform these worldwide. The next act that became famous was for Harry again, and he did a devil on a trapeze act. We have his devil costume. This is one of my favorites. And again, this was handmade. So there's his skull cap, and then the pants, and he would wear red tights with this. So he would be dressed in this devil costume, and he would be up on trapeze bars doing contortions in the air, all the while screaming at the top of his lungs. And we have newspaper reports of audience members who claimed that it was like he was right out of hell. And it was a very unsettling act because of the screaming and the contorting in the air. We also have their trapeze bars that both Harry and Frieda used. And I will grab.
And we do have a question about the devil costume. What was the material made of?
Again, well, this part is silk. And I wish our textile conservator was here. I'm not really sure what that is.
We can also answer questions in the comments below if we can't answer all of our questions today, too.
Yeah, so here, I'll put this, can you see that without a glare? There's Frieda and Harry together, and Harry's in one of his devil costumes. And so they were both contortionists. Frieda learned contortion a little later on, but there is a great quote. We have all of their letters. We have her diary, and I just want to give you a quote about what she says about contortion. And while I'm looking for it, here is Harry on top of a lamp, if you can even wrap your brain around that one. This is probably that's probably a fairly easy contortion pose for Harry. And then here are a couple other close-ups. But with the exception of the Frog's Paradise, most of his acts were done in the air. By 1921, Frieda started going by the stage name La Marletta, and that's when she started to get into, she called it the aerial business. So she wrote in her journal, "I was a novel for this aerial business." Actually, I'm going to hold off on that one. Sorry. And then you can see that I don't want to give away the good stuff yet. And then you can see from these broadsides that they really did perform all over the globe.
Oh, we have a question. Did they sell these photographs at shows? All of our photographs we've been showing.
Yes, some of them were, and I don't have any examples, but most of these, like the Frieda in the frog costume, they would be sold as postcards. And we have several of those, but most of these bigger ones were just their promotional materials that they would use to try to get new jobs in different circuses or vaudeville acts. So after the Devil act, Frieda really tried to up the ante. She got a job at in London in 1924, and she was ready to really push the limits of what she could do. So she writes, I was a novice for this aerial business. Next on the list was a mouthpiece, a leather strap on which was attached an imprint of your whole gums. It had to fit just so. I broke it in slowly, holding the contraption firmly in my jaws. It hurt tremendously. The pulling of the sinuses, the muscles, it was downright killing. I wasn't a chicken anymore, 34 by now, although I looked 20. I weighed about 125. Every day I went to the big top for practice, hard practice. The next stop was to hang in the air by my teeth in a contortion trick. This had never been done before. So with both legs behind my neck firmly, I started to hang by my teeth. Imagine that. And this on a twisted rope that uncoiled swiftly in the high air. The dizziness I had to cope with was out of this world. When they got me down, they held me for some time. It was that bad. So Frieda's next act, like I just mentioned, was a contortion act in the air, and she hung on by her teeth. And we actually have her trapeze teeth bit. You can see where she would hold on.
And we do have a question, what, if any, unique anatomy did they possess which gave them the ability to do the acts they did?
I will answer that in a second, which is a great question, but I'm going to finish talking about this. So Frieda got a job in London to perform this new act, and it was called the Whirl of Death. And she performed it around the world, and it got a little notoriety. But when she was invited to the Palladium in London in 1927, she decided to up the ante. So when she started, she would be hanging like this from here, and there would just be a rope that would coil. And as the rope uncoiled, it would spin her around. Her next level was having the circus folks put a 110 volt motor on it so she could spin to the volt. But then when she got to London, she really wanted to up the ante. She was 80 feet in the air, and she wanted a 220 volt electricity to spin her that much faster. She performed for 6 weeks, and she had 5 days left. And on the 5th to last day, her teeth or her jaw gave out, and she was tossed through the air, landed, ended up in the hospital, and lived, and was still able to do contortion. She did the act after that, but she didn't use the electric motor. And we have the newspapers that talk about, the next day that were in the newspapers and the headlines talking about this woman who was thrown through the air at the circus and whether or not she would live. So it's a fantastic, it's fun to think about what it would look like. So getting back to your question about what kind of muscles or what was different about these folks' bodies, other than the fact that they were in fantastic shape and very limber. I had a quote about Harry. And so he talks about that he has, this is a quote from Harry. "There are certain tricks in which I actually dislocate joints. Those are tricks in which I turn over with my hands locked. I am willing to have my hands tied firmly behind my back, be left alone, and then appear with my arms in front. Unless you can guess any trick in this, the only possible way to do it is to dislocate my shoulders." And then, according to our archives here in the collection, Harry was also able to do one trick that he would not perform on stage because it was too spectacular. But it completely baffled doctors and scientists. He would drop his chin down to his chest and then bend forward, keeping his chin depressed, and he could move his chin all the way down the front of his body to his thorax and abdomen. And he could do this frequently and rapidly. I think now they've had it in sideshows as kind of like a human snake or a human reptile. And then he spoke about this specific contortion in one of his journals. That was what the doctors can't understand. it isn't only the arching of my backbone that puzzles them, they absolutely can't make out what becomes of the organs which are packed inside my body. Personally, I don't know what happens to them. I only know that they get out of the way what I want them to, and they allow me to bend. So apparently doctors all over Europe would examine DeMarlo. One doctor in Paris supposedly offered him 10,000 francs for his body upon his death so he could study it. We don't think that happened. So what happens? So these performers performed through the 20s, 30s. By the 1940s, they were, Frieda was in her early 50s and Harry was in his late 50s, and they decided to retire. They bought a farm in Walton, New York, which is in Delaware County, and they didn't give up show business totally. They started training dogs to act in the circuses. And the last artifact that we're going to show you is one of their dog frog costumes that they made for their animals. It's one of our favorites here at the State Museum. It's got a little zipper on the side. But they trained dogs for 30, 35 years in Walton, and they lived until, Harry lived until he was, I think, 83 years old, and Frieda lived until she was 92. She died in 1980, and we were able to get this collection here at the State Museum because in the 80s, curators went to an auction to purchase a couple of the items, and when the auction house realized that it was the New York State Museum bidding on the collection, they decided to, the museum won half of the collection, and then the auction house decided to donate the rest of the collection here. So the DeMarlo collection probably has over 2,000 artifacts total. We have interviews with Frieda later on in her life. So both Harry and Frieda are buried in Walton, New York, and it's just they're just a interesting and fascinating couple. They did do a show here in Albany at the Armory, and Frieda talked about how drafty her dressing room was there, which if you are from Albany and you know what the Armory looks like, you could imagine that. And they played in Rochester and Buffalo in smaller theaters. So if you're interested, I wrote an article for the Archives magazine years ago. I think it's still available. It might be available online. But this kind of charts their life and has some really great images as well. And as we move through bringing more of the New York State Museum's collections to you, if there's some collection in history that you would love to see, let us know. We're thinking about doing a stoneware tour, but we've got furniture, we've got paintings, toys, you name it, we probably have it, and we would love to share it with everybody. So keep coming back to these Facebook Lives, and we'll keep pulling out collections.
Excellent. And we do have a couple of questions that are okay to answer. Two questions asking if there are any films of their performances.
Not that I'm aware of. We do have, like I mentioned, some interviews with Frieda, but we have not listened to them yet because they're on a version of a tape that we don't currently have. I think we can get it. We just haven't done it yet.
Excellent. And did they have any children?
They did not. They did not.
Great.
Okay, great. Thanks for showing up.